start. Hello everyone. Welcome to my talk about bringing documentation to life with Asciidoctor Gradle. Thanks for coming here, for giving your time to my talk. My name is Markus Schlichting, and before we dive into the topic, a little bit of introduction about myself, just to let you know who talks to you. I'm a software engineer working in Basel with engineering. I'm regularly organizing the Hacker Garden in Basel itself, where we started the whole Hacker Garden 5 years ago. Now it's kind of spreading around the world, which is really nice to see. There are lots of Hacker Gardens happening. If you want to know what a Hacker Garden is, stop by at hackergarden.net, and if you're around Switzerland sometime, there will probably once a month Hacker Garden in the city near you. So I would be happy to meet you somewhere, sometimes there. If you want to contact me, there's my Twitter handle as well as my email address. Feel free to drop me a note or message anytime. Okay, so what will this talk be about? I'll give you a short overview. First, we have a look at the current situation in the world of documentation. What do we do when we document? And I'll give you an introduction to Asciidoc and an Asciidoctor, as well as Gradle, as I want to show you the great power that comes out of the combination of the two. Then I have some demo time for you, so it's not just looking at slides here. I also want to show you practical examples and how nice it is to use the whole setup. And when we come to living documentation, as I promised you in the abstract, I have even more demonstration work for you to show for more what living documentation really means. And by the end, we have even more additional boosts I can tell you about to get you on the topic of Asciidoctor Gradle. So, looking at the current situation, what's today the use case or the case if you need to do documentation? We have several systems. You can see here like chaos running around, which really bother us or hassle us in the work we need to do to get our documentation done. Basically, those drive us crazy because it's a different tool set than we used to when we develop. It's not as floating, especially if we come to the most recent development in software, in the creation of software applications, where we want to do continuous delivery, where we have to do automation as much as possible, and where we leverage from all the powers that come from all the utilities we use. The documentation sometimes feels like a step back, okay, and now I need to do the documentation and think of so much details to bring them aligned with my current situation of the project. It would be really nice if doing the documentation is as fluent and as easy as we can do if we do code, or if we just open our email editor and drop an email to someone. And who comes in to do that is Asciidoctor. Asciidoctor is based on Asciidoc as a syntax. Asciidoc is a fairly old system compared to the new movement with Asciidoctor. So first, a look at the Asciidoc syntax, which is shown here on the left, and it's really tiny here. Later in the examples, I can show you more detail how concise and how easy to learn it is. But this just gives a first impression of how little or how easy it is to get from an Asciidoctor documentation to a nicely formatted document. And just to quote someone, I found a quote from Linus Torvalds, who bought us the nice tools, or the nice Linux and Git, and he, the master himself, says, use Asciidoctor. And he stated that it's actually readable and easier to parse than other formats. So he really also is on the train of Asciidoctor. Now, from Asciidoc to Asciidoctor, it is that as the implementation of the Asciidoc processor got fairly old and was hardly to integrate with modern tools, So Asciidoctor was created, which is a new modern implementation of the Asciidocs parser or converter using Ruby. And using Ruby really brings the nice thing for us on the JVM that there's JRuby. And by this combination, we are able to use all the Asciidoctor stuff with a nice integration of JRuby and some wrappers in our JVM world. So there's already been enough work done so we can integrate it in our tool chain. We can, as I will show you in the examples later on. There's no, even if it is implemented with Ruby, we as the JVM guys don't need to care about that. There are wrappers, we can just use all of the Asciidoctor world in our JVM-based project. Asciidoctor supports extensions, which is really nice to add for special functionality for our project. And there is even the possibility together with Gradle to do very simple extensions or really nice extensions within the build script. Like a blog post of Huber showed that you can do something like the short of your bug tracker, like in Jira, and pass that and convert that into a link to your bug tracker. And this is just a few lines of code. This is possible with the Asciidoctor implementation. It provides many output formats, of course, HTML and PDF, and with PDF other ebook formats. So, and on top of that, on top of this baseline we need for the regular things, we can convert the output of Asciidoctor basically to everything via the dogbook toolchain. While we don't want to create dogbook because it's an XML format which is not easy to maintain, the toolchain behind it to convert to many different other output formats is really major. And so it's nice that we can get from Asciidoctor via dogbook to anything else we want or we need to, we are forced to sometimes. Yep.
One question is this really good tooling, the reason why you do not use Markdown instead? Because everyone else seems to use Markdown.
Yes, I don't see really a comparison to Markdown within the slides, but Markdown is like the baseline of an ASCII format. So you have really basic formatting features, and if you then have a look at Asciidoctor, then you see that there are more features provided by Asciidoctor. So if you would see Markdown, Asciidoctor, and LaTeX would be the most extensive thing you can think of and do anything you can do in a layout you can think of. And Markdown is a really basic thing for like for the README files on GitHub. And Asciidoctor sits in the middle of them. Another nice thing with Asciidoctor is that you actually have maintainable tables. You can do them with ASCII, or you can embed CSV files, which is great for bigger tables, as you can load up your CSV files in your kind of Excel or Office program to maintain big tables, and then even embed those into your documentation. And still, you're still not bound to a binary format, which would not be able to easily compare or be tracked. And finally, there are emoticons. If you don't have heard of them, I will show them in the examples. Where is Asciidoctor used? It's used really widespread. We just focus most of the time on our IT projects, but the movement already got so far that they are publishers using to write books, and to self-publishing toolchain is really major, especially as the ebook generation of ebooks is possible and not so complicated. Many people who write small ebooks do the self-publishing using Asciidoctor. One example for an ebook, I also listed in the slides at the end with the resources, is the Practical Ruby guide Peter Groot is working on. So, and as you can see here with my slides, it's possible to create slides with Asciidoctor, which is really nice, not to hassle with the presentation tool. Just write Asciidoc with the content of the slides and then fiddle a little bit, then you have a nice presentation. And there, it leverages from several JavaScript toolkits to do so. So it's not implementing something special, something new. It's just converting the Asciidoc output into what those React.js or Vue.js want to have to get the presentation into the browser. So, on the other hand, we want to combine the power of Asciidoctor with something that brings it into our project, that enables us to use it. And here comes Gradle into play. I must say much about Gradle, as it's the new upcoming build system. Who has not worked with Gradle yet? Okay, that's, that's as I expected. Just for completeness, a small example of the full Gradle example. This is a build script for Java application, but as you all have worked with Gradle, I don't need to say much about this. Now, the combination of those two, Asciidoctor and Gradle together. This is done, as I said, with some wrappers, bringing the JRuby into our build, and on top of that the Asciidoctor J wrapper, and then the Asciidoctor Gradle plugin. And as I promised you in the overview, I have some examples prepared, so let's see real code. First of all, why do we write? We don't want to look all the time just as at. Is this already? Okay. This is an Asciidoctor syntax. So you see, like similar to Markdown, you have markers for the heading levels. You have metadata you can define. Those colon introduced things are variables. I will come to them in a later example. And then you can use the basic formatting stuff you probably already know from some wiki syntax or from Markdown or similar. And now, as I type here and I would change something, I just don't want to all the time go onto my console like I would do here and have to type Gradle Asciidoctor to generate the new version of my documentation. This is just one step too much. So as I just did it, I can show you first of all the output. So, HTML. This will be the output of my example. This is noteworthy. Asciidoctor does a lot for you by default. So the default template just creates a table of contents. You can say where you want to have it, on the right side or on the left side. It creates a footer at the bottom, and those icon here is an example for those emojicons. This is from the source. You just can say tip, or you can put say also info here. Recompile it up. This was not recompiled. Reload, and here we go. Not working example. One. Okay. I noticed that earlier. Maybe it's also related to the non-working Wi-Fi. That would surprise me for the moment. Okay, but let's go on. Apart from that, it also generates per default or if you configure it in your build script, the PDF variant. And this is also already within table of contents, single title page, and then in here your documentation with syntax highlighting. And this is already very easy set up, as I can show you with the Groovy Gradle script. This is all you need to set up, or this is even more than you actually need to set up the base build for Asciidoctor. This is pulling in the JRuby dependency, and on top of that the Asciidoctor J and Asciidoctor Gradle plugins. And down here you have already some attributes to configure the output. We configure HTML5 and PDF, and say, for example, that we want to save page numbers on the PDF. So now to the thing that we don't want to recompile by hand every time we change something in the source document. So there comes the Gradle watch task into play, which I configured down here. Here I say which files I want to monitor and which tasks should be executed as soon as something changes. So I can now go to the command line, say Gradle watch, and it loads up and starts watching. And as soon as I now go to my document here and change this back to div, save it, I can see it starts running here as it notes that the source document was changed. And it would go now back to the browser, reload this, then I have my tip icon there. And this is really handy that I just do not need to do this interim step. I just can switch between my source document and my browser to reload and see the changed document. If I want, or if I need to do PDF, and I have a PDF viewer that automatically reloads, which I up to now only found with KDE. Unfortunately, I didn't found one for macOS yet. Haven't found one. But Ocula for KDE, for example, automatically reloads PDF as soon as it's changed, which is really nice, because then you have, if your screen is big enough, you can edit the source document and see the PDF changing live. This is in case you need to create a PDF. This is also possible in the browser. There are plugins you can use in the browser, which would then monitor the HTML file as soon as that's changed, that it would then reload the document in the browser. Then same thing, you edit the source file and get a live view on your final document. Okay. So let's continue here. That was the watch task as the first thing. Next thing, to ease up or to really leverage from the power to combine our documentation into our build system, is that we could do version number integration, which really helped us to align or to keep together what we have as a documentation with our project. That we can generate on a production build or on a release build the version number into the documentation, and if someone opens up the documentation, he really sees, okay, this was the documentation for version X, and we never need to struggle with outdated documentation without knowing that we are looking at outdated documentation. Let me show you how easy this can be done. Just cancel the watch for the moment. Git check out. Hang on, I need to git slash first. Okay. And now back to our IDE. We now can see here. First of all, let's have a look at the Gradle properties. We have here the property files for our build where we define the version number. Then we have our build, which configures an attribute for our, our Asciidoctor task. Here we basically tie our version information from the build into the properties for Asciidoctor. And the source for this project version, now it is a properties file, but this can be anything. With Asciidoctor Gradle, you can pull your version number wherever you need to get it from. There are endless possibilities with Gradle. And now, as I have here defined the property, I can use that within my Asciidoctor document. Here at the top, I would define now a variable revision number product version, and this is the glue between those two. And then I can use this revision number wherever I want to in the document, and by default, it is used by Asciidoctor for the footer, as I can show you when we generate now the documentation again. Reload. And now we have it down here. This is the default template for the HTML documentation of Asciidoctor. We have it here in the footer. So without doing anything more than just including the ref number and glue it together with the variable that comes from the build script, I already have it in my documentation. Now I know which version of documentation I look at. Also, back to the source code, I can of course use this in my document and throughout my document, as I've done it here in the header. I used it here as the brackets product version. So, and then in my document, it would be replaced by the value of the property. This is of course not limited to the version number. I think that's clear. You can type anything you want from the build into the documentation. Okay, another really nice thing of the combination Gradle with Asciidoctor is the possibility to include tested code into your documentation. You can, as our normal project build is, we have our product code, we have a unit test or whatever test to keep an eye that what we changed is actually working. And then we have our documentation. Up to now, sometimes there is a situation where we want to show some code snippets in the documentation, and we go and copy parts of our methods into the documentation. 5 months later, we realize, oh, that was refactored. What the documentation said is nowhere in the code anymore. And Asciidoctor comes to help in this situation by letting us include snippets from our source code into the documentation. I can show you. So our project just changed here. We now have source name, Java demo business. This is our business code. And of course we have tests for that. That would make sure our method returns 42. And now the glue, on the one hand, with our build does not change much. With one thing, I can make my Asciidoctor task depend on the test task. So I hook into it and make sure that every time a documentation is generated, the tests are run. And so I would not get a documentation with false examples if the tests are not valid. Oh, and now in the Asciidoctor source, I have down here the block where I had the snippet before. I didn't really point to that, but before it was source code in the Asciidoctor file. Now I don't have code, the source code not anymore in the Asciidoctor file, but I reference to my source still and to my Java file and include it. And as you see at the end, I specify the lines of the method I want to include. And the outcome of this would look like this. We actually then have just our method from our business class, the show my code method in our documentation. So of course, obviously this is not the optimal solution, as if we would now have to refactor here and extract a variable and have to do some calculation in there, and that calculation would actually be another variable. And now we would regenerate our documentation. Hang on, this probably is not working as Gradle thinks the documentation is already up to date. No. And now, here's the problem with referencing lines. Of course, this is not working. Okay. Of course, Asciidoctor has already a solution to that. We can do a reference, or not just by lines. We can also reference by text, as I can show you. So back to our source code, the just show my code method is gone, and now I have entered code comment lines here with defining a tag, and this tag can be used then in Asciidoctor to reference the snippet I want to use in my documentation. As you can see here at the end, I don't have, at the end of the line, I don't have any line numbers anymore. I have the tag for the snippet I want to include from the source code. So my would now show again the real method, and even if I refactor something in my code now, or I would include any code, this would not break the included snippet in my documentation anymore. So I did a reload. Maybe you'll notice by the updated timestamp. Besides fixing the snippet and include into the documentation, the other benefit is also that any developer who comes to that code in the actual production code and needs to refactor or change something would also notice, oh, okay, this is used in the documentation. Maybe I should, after my change, check back to the documentation and see if I need to update that as well, which would not be the case by referencing it just by lines. There would be no back reference on the code that is used in the documentation. Okay. Questions so far? Okay, then some words about Git. You already saw with that I like Git is the demos. One thing I want to stress is that with Git and being Asciidoctor documentation ASCII based, it's really nice to deal with it in a project setup where you maybe are already developing on feature branches or something, because you can combine the changes in the source code, you need to implement a feature. With the changes in the documentation, you need to document the feature. And this both comes together onto master or on your development branch together, and it's not needed to track them separately. Also for code reviews, if you do pull or merge requests, you can really reflect, is the change documented well enough, is it incorporated into the documentation. And it's really something the power of Git adds to the power of Asciidoctor Gradle. This is really nice. But the first thing on my slide is split and structural documentation. It's the thing with the variables I showed for the version number can be extended to almost anything else. You can then something that might change or that needs to be configurable pass into your documentation and have them dynamic, kind of. And the other thing is that you can, of course, use includes with your documentation. So you can split up your documentation into multiple files, into chapter or module-based documentation, and then have it all glued together into one big document. This enables us to apply the dry principle also to our documentation. We don't need to repeat things that might be needed again and again in the documentation because someone might jump into and look at a special thing, and we don't want to reference, we want to show it then right there, but we don't want to duplicate that piece of documentation, so we need to maintain it again and again, so we can use include files or variables to avoid such duplication. As I said, pull and merge requests make it just easier to handle documentation involvement for our project. And what I also like about this is that this lowers the barrier for us as technical people to do the documentation as it's the same tool chain we are used to and we like to work with. We don't need to switch tools. We just are in the same context. We just can focus on the documentation itself and do not need to stress ourselves with different tools and different workflows. This, of course, also lowers the barrier of new members to your team. So no or less additional tools they need to learn, the faster they get into your project and can contribute. As I said, plays well with feature branches and integrate releases and create the right documentation for your release. As I said, you always have the right documentation at hand. Okay. The creation process is, itself, as I already referenced to it with the watch task of Asciidoctor and auto update in several tools. There are, of course, other ways, like the preview functionality with some plugins. For example, if I look at IDEA, I have down here, if I install the Asciidoctor template plugin, sorry, I can switch to a preview tab and have a quick preview at hand. As you see, with some special things, it has difficulties. So this is really just preview functionality. But it's getting better and better. It's also like embedded images and similar things are processed continuously better. And it's also, there's a plugin available for Eclipse, and for the biggest browser there are plugins available. One word to the Firefox plugin, if you might have tried that in the couple last months, it had difficulties. But during last 2 weeks it got updated, and I was told that now it should be more or better maintained. Some things got sorted out, so there should be more regular updates now. And the nice thing with the plugins, with browsers, is that you can point your browser then to an Asciidoctor file, and it would just render it in the browser. So no need to process it on the command line anymore. You can just write something and show it. And this is really handy, and yeah. makes it easier to work with Asciidoctor. Okay, and now let's talk about specification by example and living documentation. One way to make your documentation more living, I already showed by including the tested snippets into your documentation and have them validated each time you build your documentation. There is another perspective or another aspect of specification by example which would incorporate data which can be maintained and looked by business people into your build and then into your documentation. This is also sometimes related or mentioned together with BDE, behavior-driven development. And I show you an example and show how nicely this plays together with Gradle and Asciidoctor. Okay, let's say we still have our business function. This hasn't changed. And we have our source for our documentation. And as I mentioned before, you can have tables in the Asciidoctor filled up with data from a CSV file, which I did here. So we have then resources, and here our CSV file, which is a data set. And this can be tested in a Spock test by the unroll. Oh, this line is really long. Is it somehow readable or is it too small?
It's just too small.
Okay, like this. And more space. But this is not really the important thing. This is standard Spock where you have unroll, where it would process things it gets from a data provider, and as a data provider, I down here read the CSV file, read the lines, and split them by the separation character. And this is then picked up by Spock as a data provider, and Spock would process then every line. I will show you in the execution phase, and validate those data, so it's actually working with my system. So, and if we now say Asciidoctor, and the Asciidoctor task depends on the test task, so it executes the Spock test and validates the data in the CSV file. My whole build is executed by generating documentation. And now let's have a look at our test results. This is the result from our Spock test, and here in the Spock test we see it picks up the lines from our CSV file and validates it each. This is the unroll annotation in the Spock test. And if we look at our documentation, we load it. And you see down there it's trying to fetch the font. Good. This is resolution. I don't see my right person. we go. Here we see now the table, no, here we see now the table in our documentation. And this is populated, as we saw in the source code, from our CSV file. So now we have the full circle. We have the CSV file, which is editable and openable by business people with their standard tool Excel. Right? And we incorporate that CSV file in our documentation, so it gets context from our documentation, and people can read it and see how this data is used. And on the other hand, we have our spot test, where this data is picked up and tested against our system. And this is the whole life cycle. And then even enables on top of that the business people who get explained, okay, this is the project, you need to click that icon to execute the test on your machine, and you can open this and change this CSV file to play around with the behavior of our system and see how it behaves. And this is bringing it together and shorten the feedback cycle if someone needs to validate or validate an assumption against the system without disturbing the development. Okay, then additional powers. Finally, you cannot just write text, create tables, and include nice pictures. You can even generate pictures with Asciidoctor. There is the Asciidoctor diagrams plugin, which enables us to use Plant2ML, Vita, and several other ASCII-based formats to draw pictures. And ASCII art like this would be rendered with Vita down into such a simple diagram. Even simple diagrams are often much more useful than 2 paragraphs of text, so it's really nice to use that and really useful, I figured. And on the other hand, this is still versionable and comparable or differable with Git. So if someone changed that diagram and I look at the source file, I see what he changed. And it's not buried in a binary format. Yeah, and now how to get started. I recommend, if you want to play around with Asciidoctor and Gradle, the lazy bones template. This is the most easy way to get a fully set up Asciidoctor build with Gradle. Just do lazy bones create Asciidoctor Gradle, your demo project, and play around with it. Okay, thanks for your time and your attention. May I answer any questions? Okay then, if the questions come up later, again my email address, my Twitter handle, very welcome to hear from you. Thanks a lot.